Welcome back to our Economics of Innovation course. Last week I told you something about patents, in particular patent policy. I gave you some overview of what patents are. I think that was the first slide in this chapter. So they assign an intellectual property right, saying they award you temporary monopoly position, which is then a right to this invention. And this is of particular importance as this knowledge has certain characteristics of a public good. It's particularly it's non-rival and only excludable if you have this right to this patent right, so that you can enforce exclusion. Of course, patents, and that's what I discussed with you already, are there in order to create incentive to undertake R&D. Unfortunately, the protection is not perfect. There might be imitation, there might be infringement, there might be inventing around, and I went at some detail to tell you how important patents are compared to other instruments to protect intellectual property like secrecy and so on. What I want to go to today, first of all, is optimal patent duration. What I showed to you last week is that it's really important, in particular, I think that was this slide here, for the pharmaceutical industry. It's really important how long your patent duration is, because half a year longer or a year longer might mean that you have, if you have a blockbuster drug, billions of euros more in terms of revenues. Of course, there is a trade-off, and the trade-off was first analyzed by William Northhouse. And this trade-off is just very simple. First of all, the patent wants to assign property right, and it awards a monopoly position. That's in order to provide incentive to innovate. At the same time, of course, you know that a monopoly position is bad from the viewpoint of efficiency and also from the viewpoint of distribution if you value consumer surplus high, because you get a deadweight loss with a monopoly, and of course you get profits rather than consumer surplus. Now, I want to present to you now the framework of Northhouse, and as you will see, it perfectly fits to our kind of analysis we previously did with the arrow model. And we have very similar setup. We assume a non-drastic innovation. We look into the gain from innovation, the incentive to invest in R&D. And again, it's just the monopoly or the profit gain. And of course, we have to look into the other side. That is the loss, deadweight loss due to monopoly power. This is basically our trade-off. Higher incentive to invest typically mean higher deadweight loss at the same time, so lower total welfare or lower consumer surplus. We assume that we have an R&D technology, and as it's now about the incentive to innovate, it's no longer an either-or question. It's no longer a binary R&D technology where you either invest in R&D or don't, but here you decide, just rather similar to the Gupta-Stiglitz model. Here you decide on how much to invest, and we implement that here by a parameter X, which tells you how much, by what extent do you want to reduce your unit cost, your unit production cost. And if you, for instance, if you have production cost of 100 per unit, if you want to reduce it by €5, you have to spend some value R of X. And of course, if you want to reduce it not by 5 but by €6, you have to pay more, and this is increasing. That is, you have diminishing return, because it costs you then even more to reduce costs further from 6 to €7 rather than from 5 to 6. So R&D is first of all expensive, and second, exhibits decreasing returns. That's very similar to what we had in the Gupta model and so on. That all can be just illustrated by our well-known diagram here, just our arrow model with the case of competition. Here we have our situation where our firm reduces marginal cost or variable cost here, variable unit cost by this X here. it gets then this green area in terms of a gain from innovation. This is a per period gain from innovation, and at the same time we have this deadweight loss, and of course the green area goes to the firm rather than to the consumers. Of course, here the key question will be how long or how big is this interval here? Under what circumstances will we see more investment in R&D? That is a higher X, a higher cost reduction, of course, meaning that it costs more or it requires a higher investment in R&D. So what we have here is simply this gain from innovation, and of course, as we are thinking about patents, this is generally a dynamic model because it's about time, about how many years do we want to have this patent, and that's what we turn to next. Namely, we look into what is the value of an innovation for a certain patent length T. So this is nothing else than a discounted value. As we are speaking of, say, 20 years or so, discounting is important, and we use a discount factor R, which is just 1 over 1 plus I, the discount or interest rate. Now, such an expression should be well known to you. Here you have the per period gain. This is actually just our green rectangle, your profit gain per period, and you get that from today, from period 0 to just the end of the 19th year, because from year 20 on your patent is no longer valid, and of course, so you're discounting all that. This is a capital R raised to the power of T, and then you have to also pay right now your R&D investment cost. And now, of course, you well know, hopefully you do, from your introductory math course, how to calculate such a series. You see immediately this is what you get in terms of your discounted value, 1 minus RT, 1 minus R raised to the power of T over 1 minus R times pi m minus R. Now, it's very straightforward, and it's what we always do. What we have to decide is we maximize this discounted value of profit or of the innovation by just choosing the only variable the firm can choose, and this only variable the firm can choose is the variable X. Okay, it can only choose how much to invest or which cost reduction to implement, and therefore it automatically also determines what its R is, its required investment. So what we do, we maximize this expression with respect to T, and this gives us the optimal level of R&D as a function of patent length. Okay, so what we get here, we just take the first order condition. You see, you would just get here some prime, okay, R prime and pi m prime, and of course you get some v prime here as well. And in the optimum, later on I will show you an example with a linear demand where we calculate that in detail, but the general rule should be rather clear. The marginal gain of increasing X, this is just the increase in profit, that's just a change in a rectangle, needs to be in the optimum equal to the marginal cost of R&D. Of course, here it's not just the marginal gain, it's not just a rectangle, but it's a rectangle times the time you get this discounted. Okay, that's what we have. And what is clear immediately is that longer patent life induces higher R&D expenditure as x prime of t or x prime of t is greater than 0. Okay, that should be straightforward, because then this t increases makes this negative term smaller, and therefore the whole value increases, and pi m prime minus r prime x, or then pi m prime times its value also increases. Okay, now the first thing, of course, is we need to look into how patent length affects the firm and its incentive to invest in R&D. That's what we did here, and we will do it in more detail and in a less abstract general model in say 2 or 3 slides. And the second point, what we have to look into is how consumers are affected by patent length. how consumers are affected by patent length, and we always just calculate that by looking into the consumer surplus. Here we have the capital CS is just our discounted value of the consumer surplus, whereas small cs is just the per period gain in consumer surplus. Here is our per period gain in consumer surplus. I just could jump back here to our diagram. That was the strange thing about this arrow model. Jumping back to the arrow model here, or to our illustration. The strange thing in the arrow model under competition is that consumers don't gain at all in the period of the innovation, okay? Because the price is unchanged. The only thing is that the innovator takes over the whole market, charges a price, a limit price equal to the price of the rivals, or equal to the rival's cost, or an epsilon below. Nothing is changed, only we get here the profit. And of course, once the patent expires, every competitor has this knowledge, and cost will go down to C minus X, and consumers will gain then the green rectangle plus the yellow triangle. That would then be the per period gain in consumer surplus. Okay, that's our CS of X. And again, we have an infinite series which now starts only, or here we have an infinite series. Previously we had no infinite series because it was over, the profit stream was over after 20 years. Here it only starts in year 20 that consumers gain, and it goes on until infinity. Okay, and that's just the value you get for this series. Then, of course, we want to maximize total surplus, and total surplus here is just the gain from having this innovation, and we call this net social surplus. I think I took this from either Pebble, Richards and Norman, or from Oshai's book. And this net social surplus depends on the intensity of R&D, on the cost reduction, and on the length of the patent. And of course, the intensity of the cost, or the cost reduction itself, also depends on the patent length. That's why we have these T twice here. And here the first term is just the discounted profit of the firm, and plus the second term is just the discounted value of the consumer surplus. And we just put here all our expressions we previously had. Okay. The important thing is that, of course, T matters both directly. Okay. Both directly. And here's what you see: if you reduce patent length, of course, consumers gain because they get the consumer surplus gain for a longer time. However, we have then also the indirect effect, because XT would go down, and therefore we get a smaller gain. Okay, that's basically our trade-off. Okay, what we can say at this very general point is that the optimal patent length T is positive, because otherwise with a T of 0 you don't get any R&D, and that's bad, of course. But it's not infinite, but it's finite, and that's due to these positive but diminishing returns to R&D. It gets ever more expensive to reduce costs, so extending T further leads to an ever smaller increase of X. At the same time, if you increase T very far into the future, the value of the gain to the consumers is really negligible. Okay, because if you get something only after 50 years and discounted only by 2 or 3%, it has basically a value of 0 today. Okay, that's what we have. In the notes I gave you already some results, or some kind of comparative statics on the elasticity of demand and so on, but I will get back to that later on. And that's actually what's written here: sectors with high elasticity of demand or high innovative opportunities have shorter optimal patent length. I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. And because I think I just want, you know that I like examples with linear demand function. That's why I put now the Northhouse model in terms of this linear demand function, where we simply have demand as a function of the price. S is nothing else than the number of consumers we have here. They are all identical, and S is therefore just market size. And A is the maximum willingness to pay of a certain consumer. And R&D technology is also very easy. It's just proportional. So if you want to have something like this X, it just looks like here, the alpha, here's some alpha 0. And if we have a larger alpha, it doesn't look so nice because it shouldn't be backward bending. But here alpha 1 is greater than alpha 0, meaning just that to have the same cost reduction, you have to spend more. Okay, and what you see is that the slope is increasing. That is, an additional cost reduction costs you more once you're already here than if you're here, for instance. That's a rather standard assumption, and why are we using that? Because this gives us a very nice linear first derivative, and therefore we can easily solve the problem. Okay? Yeah, if that's clear, I just want to move on. I just produced here some mathematical output because it's a lot of calculation. In the tutorial class, in assignments, you will get some specific examples, some given parameter values, so that it's straightforward to calculate. But you already know here the profit gain, this is a per period gain of the innovator from the innovation, is just our rectangle. Okay, this is just our green rectangle, exactly as it was in the arrow model. Then the discounted profit here, already as a function of the axis here, just substitutes the profit gain here, takes this sum here, and as you see, we really got it right, even because Mathematica shows us the same. So here is our cost Rx, and here is our discounted welfare gain, depending on, not welfare, but profit gain or profits here, and depending on the length of the patent. And what I do here is just taking the first derivative with respect to x. We did that previously, or that was where I just somehow cheated a little bit when I went, when I showed you, or there I just added this, where is it? Here is it, where I just added these primes here. Okay, that's what I'm doing right now. Okay, I just take the derivative with respect to the x here. Okay, and so by the way, you just are learning Mathematica. I just take the first derivative with respect to x, and you see this is very simple because the x just cancels out here, and your falls out because it's linear, and you are just left here with this gain, and this is a discounted gain, the present discounted value of this gain, and here you have the costs of R&D. Okay, and in the optimum it has to be equal, and that's a nice thing about the linear approach. You can solve it analytically, and here you get then this value for x, your optimal R&D expenditure, your optimal cost reduction x, as a function of the parameters. And parameters are always, of course, here, as you will remember, as the market size. If you have a larger market, you will want to invest more in R&D and therefore realize a higher cost reduction. If you have higher alpha, that means a higher cost of R&D. This value will be smaller, and you will invest a lot. You will invest less in R&D. Don't be confused here by how Mathematica writes that. They put a minus here. You could just turn this around with a plus and a minus if you just multiply both the numerator and the denominator by -1. And the important point now, actually, and I erase that again here, the important point right now, or the most interesting, is this T, of course. How does the T affect X optimal? And that's, I think, what is also written here, the optimal R&D intensity as a function of the parameters and of particular of the parameters of all parameters A, C, and so on, S, and of course also of T, of the length of the pattern length. Okay, and what you see is, of course, actually this would then be written as 1 minus RT here if we do this minus 1 thing. And you see if T increases, the R gets smaller, I subtract less, and the optimal X increases. Because this is so complicated to see, I just draw it or drew it here. Here you have the T, the optimal pattern length. I assumed certain parameters for the demand function, for the marginal cost to begin with, and some about 10% discount or interest rate, which gives a discount factor of 0.9. And what you see here is if we increase pattern length, we get more R&D, that is, we get a higher cost reduction. But as you see always from this concave shape, the more, or if you're already out here, an additional year of patent protection gives us hardly an increase in this X. Okay, so here again, the diminishing returns to R&D or the increasing costs of R&D kick in. And what you see already here is that it makes a lot of sense to have a positive pattern length, but it needs not be too long, because otherwise you don't get many additional or high additional return in terms of cost reduction. Okay? Yeah. That was the viewpoint, in a sense, of the firm, how the firm reacts to a change in T. The next thing is, of course, we want to maximize social surplus by choosing T. So what should really be the optimal patent length be? And of course, we have to take into account our consumer surplus. Our consumer surplus is just, this would be our green rectangle. This would be our yellow triangle, if you remember that. And so this is just a per period gain for consumers. Once the patent expires, here we get this capital CS is just the discounted value. If the patent expires after T period, capital T periods, that's after 20 years. So that's what you just get then. And social surplus, as we defined it, is just consumer surplus. Actually, we called it net social surplus previously. It's just consumer surplus plus these firm profit here, the reduced profit I just defined, and we substitute here this X with the optimal X we just calculated here. So what we are doing is here we substitute this X optimal, the value we calculated here, into our social welfare function, and then we take, and you see it's really ugly. Okay. It looks ugly, and it gets even more ugly once we take the first derivative with respect to T, because now this is really, if suppose R raised to the power of 20, if T would be 20 and so on, this is highly nonlinear and there doesn't exist any closed form solution here. Okay, that's why I drew it in the next slide for certain parameter values, again the same as we had previously, and you see how it looks like. Okay, very nice function, and you see here some clear optimum, which maximizes your social surplus. So this would be, in a sense, our optimal patent length. I want to draw to something, of course, here you see, here it's about 80,000. It doesn't start at 0 because otherwise we don't see that so well. But what you see here is this would be about 4 years. With 4 years, you have a total social surplus of about 80,000 in this simple example. If you add another 4 years so that you're at 8 years, you would get almost to 120,000. So here you see longer patent protection really brings you an enormous gain in social surplus. Why? Because you have a much higher incentive to invest in R&D. Okay, and that in the end also brings a big gain to consumers. Okay, but of course what you see here If you're already at 40 years, it doesn't hardly matter, or you don't lose, or you actually gain if you reduce patent length. You don't gain anything because you hardly any gain. You don't gain anything if you increase patent length because you don't get many more R&D expenditures, and at the same time, of course, the value of what you get in, say, 40 years for the consumers is rather low. Okay, that's a basic message. Okay, we now were able to derive this optimal patent length, and saw that it's important, first of all, that we have a positive patent length, and second, that it's finite. Okay, that were the basic results we had from Northhouse. And this is just an illustration, and I want to move on with the illustration by discussing some parameters. So here, the optimal patent length itself is a function, for instance, of the parameter alpha, and I want to show you that by means of another simulation. Of course, we could also do it generally, and I already told you that if alpha is high, that is, if the costs of doing R&D are high, firms won't invest a lot in R&D because R&D is so expensive. Okay, and here I state that high alpha implies a low innovative opportunity, since costs for doing R&D are very high, and therefore what you see here, alpha is 50. If we increase the cost of doing R&D to 100, you see you get more than 19 years of optimal patent protection compared to 16 years. So in a sense, for industries where it's very expensive to do R&D, you should have a longer patent protection. Okay, and that's what I also draw in the next slide. Here you have the alpha again, and you see, note that it starts at the value start at 1, because if costs are 0, you don't need long patent protection. If costs for doing R&D, the point is here is the optimal patent length here as a function of the alpha is the blue line here. Okay, alpha is the blue line as a function of alpha. So if alpha increases, if the costs of doing R&D increase, the optimal patent length extends, it becomes longer. Okay, that should be rather clear. At the same time, however, what is interesting here is that it's in a rather small range. Okay, here the costs increase 200-fold from 1, say, to 200. And remember, it was our R&D cost, R of x, was a times x square, in a sense. So it increases 200-fold, but you just increase from 10 to, say, 25 years. But I think this is not so surprising. What is I think even more interesting is the effect of market size. The point is, if you increase market size, you lead only less patent protection because you have a high incentive to invest in R&D anyway. But if you have really small markets, that's if you go into this direction, you see that patent protection, in a sense, really explodes almost. Okay, and that's really interesting because we have a provision in our patent acts, both in the US on the European level. It's the so-called Orphan Drug Act. In the US, it's called Orphan Drug Act. In Europe, it's called similarly. This is for drugs which are so-called rare diseases. Okay, which affect only a small number of patients, and if so, that is this is really a drug where okay, this affects only 20,000 people in Germany, so your market size is only 20,000, whereas rheumatoid arthritis it's 800,000, so it's quite different. And what you see here is that it's optimal for smaller market size to have a longer patent length, and that's actually what's done in this patent in this Orphan Drug Act. And I think it says that I don't know whether it's because that's rather involved, but you get at least an extra 5, maybe even an extra 10 or 12 years of patent protection for these orphan drugs. And here you see this importance of the market size. Okay, it seems to have been clear, so I move on with another dimension of patent protection, namely patent breadth. Length is just one measure of patent protection. The other is breadth and Patentbreite. However, this is really a complicated thing because it's not accepted. And if you look into the literature, Klemperer calls the breadth width, and Gilbert and Shapiro call it breadth. So it's rather complicated. But anyway, I try to give you an idea what patent breadth is. And I just use the example of the apple, okay? A broad patent might cover just all apples. So if you invented, of course, Apple is no technology, therefore it's no easy to get patent protection for that. I don't know at all whether you can get patent protection, and it's still a discussion with biotechnically modified plants whether you get protection. But just to give you the example, okay, a broad patent would mean that a patent covers all apples. So you are not allowed to produce any apple. A more narrow or thinner patent would mean that it only covers red apples. So do you know any other apples of any other colors? Yeah, this would actually be a question for I think I have it even written. I have it written in a note anyway. So it wouldn't cover, for instance, green apples. And you saw this cage. The Golden Delicious is a green apple. So by this kind of patent, green apples wouldn't be covered. And you might have even a narrower patent which just has a certain type of apple or covers a certain type of apple which is defined by a certain degree of red color and of sweetness, like the Gala apple or Elster. So you could go with me to the Gießen Wochenmarkt on Saturday. So then you see all the different kinds of apples which are available. But the point here is you see what the different breadth means. Okay, there is a long discussion, I think, in the notes what that means in terms of the, I think it was a cottage some engine you need in harvesting cotton, and how different another new type of machine has to be from your original type in order for getting a patent awarded. And the question is here, how or put it differently here, what is the required minimum degree of difference? Okay, so if it's a very thin patent, it might be very easy to just cultivate a new apple which just captures an Elster and say Gala apple, and you get a new one and it's different from your original Gala, so you're awarded a patent. This would be a very thin patent, okay? But if it's a thick patent which covers all red apples, it will be much harder for you to come up with a new type of apple. So this breadth of the patent determines how difficult it is to invent around. And the question in the literature is whether you should have short and fat or short and broad patents or long and thin patents. If you think in terms of books, each book gets awarded an almost infinitely long, actually it has a copyright of 75 years, which is close to infinity, I think. And it has a very long patent. It's not a patent, it's a copyright, but just for the sake of the example. But it's very thin, it only covers the specific text, okay? It doesn't cover your what is it called, your genre, for instance. If you're the guy who wrote these stories about Bavarian or some Bavarian crime novel, others might also use the same type of characters, okay? Because you'll get a very thin patent, whereas they could also be fat, and it could be, fat would just mean that it's very hard to invent around. And just to cut that short here, the point is that if you have very efficient product markets, it's better to have a short and fat patent, because then you don't have this duplication of efforts and so on, because it doesn't pay to invest so much for this short period. Another dimension is patent height or patent height. That is a minimum inventive step. Okay, how much better does your innovation be as a previous one? So in a sense, if you have produced the Apple iPhone 10 and now you're producing the Apple iPhone 12, is that sufficiently different at all to get a new patent awarded, for instance? There are no patents for the whole iPhone, of course, but only for certain parts of it. But how much different does it have to be? If it has a notch, is the notch then patentable? Is that a high inventive step? Okay. And finally, I already mentioned this term patent width, even though it might be confused with patent breadth. But typically it's used in this respect here. It's a range of applications for which the patent holds. This is particularly important for pharmaceutical drugs. For instance, Humira, I think it's called adalimumab, the original name. Humira is one of the best-selling drug at all. They had, I think, AbbVie had sales worldwide sales of much more than 10 billion each quarter of a year, and originally it was against RA, rheumatic arthritis. And however, it turned out that it also works against morbus Crohn and other diseases. Okay, the question is then, and this was found out by some medical doctor typically. And the question is then, does patent protection still apply if someone else, but not the inventor, finds out that it works also for another disease? And it still applies if no modification is required. Okay. But if a modification is required, the new product might be patentable. That holds typically if you develop a chip for a computer, but then you use it in a car, but you have to reconfigure it. Okay? In the notes, I gave you some more stories and about and facts about patent or patent breadth and so on, and about AbbVie and so on. I think AbbVie has over 70 formulation and it's used for many different diseases. Okay, that was it about patent, but we are not yet done, because what is really closely involved or related to patenting is licensing. What does this mean, licensing? You share your typically patented technology or technical knowledge for a price. Okay, you allow others to use your knowledge. And over 80% of all patented inventions are licensed, either exclusively or to several firms. And the question is, why are innovators doing that? Why do they have an incentive to license typically non-drastic innovation? That's what we are interested here. In Bertrand competition, it's rather straightforward that you don't have any incentive to license, and as always, you see this is the most important diagram in a sense which we have. You see if you have made an invention which provides you just with this here, and you are with this green area, and you have this cost reduction from C to C minus X, you could just license this technology to a rival at a price of X times QI of C minus X, and that's this price, and that just would be the same profit you can realize by licensing as you can do it by using it yourself. So it doesn't really make sense in a Bertrand world to license, in a Bertrand world of homogeneous products. This is rather different in a Kuno world, and that's what we are going to discuss a little bit later in a little bit more detail. Here is what you typically charge is a so-called royalty. This is a per unit fee. Okay, you ask your licensee has to pay just the X, and the interesting thing, your rival then gets this cost reduction, but has to pay exactly the same amount to you. So your rival's costs are actually unchanged, the quantities are unchanged, but you get some return, and that's the important point here. Here you see some empirical presentation of how important licensing is. You see here patenting increased, but this is red or I don't know, pink, the color of the patents. Patents increased from say 40,000 to 160 to 180,000, and these are the patents here held by non-US companies. And here you see what the worldwide royalty and license revenue is. And here for a long time until the 70s it was rather low, but now it's at 80,000 millions. Okay, this 80 billion. So this is really big business. Okay. So you see how valuable intellectual property is, and you see also, of course, how valuable these patents is, because they only award you this value to the patent. They only award you this intellectual property. Yeah, now licensing of a drastic innovation, it's clear that you would never license a drastic innovation, because then you would have two firms in the market rather than one, and that's where we get our efficiency effect. The monopoly profit is greater than a duopoly profit. Then the other, so that should be obvious. The other question is then, how does your licensing contract look like? Do you want to have a per unit license? Think of the PlayStation related point. If you are a developer of a game for PlayStation, you typically have to pay a license fee to Sony for the PlayStation, or to Microsoft for the Xbox, for each game, for each copy of the game you sell. Okay. On the other hand, it might also be a fixed fee independent of output. Now, if you license, if you're an outside firm and you're the licensor and you have some monopolist who is a licensee, you would want, actually, which kind of licensing contract? You would want to have a fixed fee equal to the gain from innovation. Actually, we could just look into one of our other just monopoly diagrams here. The point is, if you charge a per unit fee, that increases the marginal cost of your monopolist, and therefore reduces or also increases the price and reduces the profit. You get what is called the double marginalization problem. So this royalty increases cost, reduces profit, and the gain from license technology. I think we discussed that at some length in the industrial organization course, so I don't want spend much more time here. But it's actually straightforward. I think if it's not clear, I think we even have a problem on that. Yeah. Is licensing a good thing from the social point of view? Actually, it is typically, okay? I just sketched the Kuno case. In this case, you license your new technology to your rival. Your rival's actual costs are unchanged, because physical costs, in a sense, go down by 10 euro, but the rival has to pay this 10 euro to you in terms of the license fee. But so the total cost is unchanged. Then your equilibrium will also be unchanged. In particular, the price will be unchanged, and therefore the rival's profit as well as the consumer surplus. But your profit increases, and therefore you have an increase in profit, and this could increase your incentive to invest. Okay, this is a Pareto improvement, clearly. And it also can prevent wasteful duplication of R&D effort. If some technology is already invented, it's better to just license it than to try to invent around. And so if inventing around is possible, the patent owner typically could just charge a license fee equal to the R&D cost it would require to invent around. And finally, of course, there are problems from the viewpoint of the firm in terms of licensing. It's not clear whether your license holder yearly pays. Okay. The other point is there might be a leakage of knowledge. That is, you give them the license, and then they use your technology, your knowledge to develop something which then becomes a competitor to you. And it might also be a collusive device. There are so-called patent pools and so on, reciprocal licensing. I license something to you, and you pay me something, and you license something to me, and I pay something, and we both inflate our cost and therefore can implement the collusive solution. Okay. Yeah, in that respect, there is a huge discussion on so-called SSO, standard setting organizations, and so-called standard essential patents. That's in particular relevant in terms of mobile telecommunications, in terms of the 5G, 4G, and 3G standards. There you typically have many licenses. I think, I don't know, we don't have these numbers, but in 5G you probably have tens of thousands of patents which are part of the standard, and if your patent becomes part of that standard, you agree to license on FRAND terms, where FRAND stands for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. Okay, why do I tell you this? Because it's so important. You see, all these smartphone producers or people who are somehow related to the smartphone and telecoms business, like Apple, like Nokia, Samsung, Google, Motorola, Microsoft, and so on, LG, Sony, Ericsson, they all have law cases against each other. Okay, so Apple takes HTC to court, HTC takes Apple to court, Samsung takes Apple to court, Apple takes Samsung to court, and so on. And here you see a filing of all those cases. Okay, each one is litigating everyone, apart from a few like Digitude. These, I don't know whether they are trolls, but you see only one-way errors here. So they seem to litigate against everyone. Okay, so there's so much litigation going on, and you might have noticed that I think Apple was not allowed to sell some Apple phones in Germany for some time, whereas Samsung was not allowed to sell some Samsung phones in US for some time due to these patent suits. Okay, and so it's really important, and where I get the next slide here, the estimated patent arsenals. How do you protect yourself against this? Here I have this with the wireless standards. The point is, in order to defend yourself, it's best that you have, if your rival has a patent which is essential, it's best that your rival also has to use a patent from you, which is essential. So here you see in 2G it was 240 patents which were essential, and in 4G is 4,000, and there are 500,000 other relevant patents here. And here's what you see, and here I bought Nokia shares at some time when the share price was really low. And why did I buy it? Because I thought simply the patents they own, they have more than 10,000 patent families, are valuable so much or much more than their stock market value. Okay, and here you see, why do you think did Google buy Motorola? Google had at that time only a few patents. Okay, they bought it not because they wanted to build these wonderful Motorola phones. We just saw that Motorola really has many 17,000 patents and 7,500 applications. Microsoft acquired Northhouse patents. Oracle has many patents on its own. Okay, that's what you see. Patent arsenals are very, very important. And how important patents are is, as you see from this settlement we saw last year. Actually, that was just before when I gave this lecture, or this particular lecture, a year ago. You see here it's 1st of May 2019. There was a settlement between Qualcomm and Apple. Everyone knows Apple, but I don't know whether you know Qualcomm. It's a company which produces, in a sense, chips and modems here. Okay, and Apple actually, Qualcomm in a sense is almost a monopolist there. Apple at some time wanted to get Intel as a rival, but they didn't manage to come up with the right kind of technology that Apple could produce a 5G iPhone, and that's why Apple had to go back to Qualcomm, and that cost them dearly. They had to pay 4.5 to 4.7 billion to solve their problems. Okay, there was this trial. Qualcomm, I think, was suing Apple that they used some patent illegitimately, and so they really, Apple will pay for using Qualcomm chips really a high amount of money. And that's what you see. This is not what they pay in the future, but that's what they pay for the past. That's about it for patents for the second. I will make another break here because I move on to the next chapter, which again has patents. But what you saw is that it's rather good to have a patent because it awards you a lot of money if it's a important, relevant technology. The bad thing about patents is you have to get it awarded, and what you will see in a minute is in order to get it awarded, you have to be the first to get a patent. Okay, getting back to patents. So I just asked whether you remember what FRAND is. Fair, this is just licensing based on fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory license fees. This is really a big topic for economists, where we work as economic experts in order to determine what really fair is. And of course, fair is a rather complicated thing. Okay, now going back to our patent races, what does this mean? The point is the timing of innovation is important. Suppose you are called, I just have to look into my notes. Suppose you are called Elijah Gray and you come up, actually I don't know whether Elijah Gray ever met Philip Reis. Do you know Philip Reis? He's from somewhere in Hesse, and actually he invented a previous or a preliminary version of the telephone about in the 1850s. In 1876, I think it was. I just have to look up my notes. In 1876, Elijah Gray went to the patent office and wanted to patent something which was an improvement in telegraphy, which was actually, I think, Elijah Gray's attorney filed a caveat for a telephone just a few hours later entitled Transmitting Vocal Sounds Telegraphically. Okay, the point is Alexander Graham Bell and Elijah Gray were both in the US Patent Office on February 14th, 1876. Alexander Graham Bell was there a few hours earlier. He got the patent for the telephone awarded, and he became then the owner of AT&T, and he became very rich. Okay, versus Elijah Gray, I don't know whether he died poor, but anyway, he didn't become so famous. So here you see the point is, it's very important to be first, and actually the winner takes all. If you're the first to have a patent awarded, you get all the award. The second one just doesn't get the patent and therefore cannot sell it. Okay, the first firm to innovate obtains a patent, and that means it's actually a race. Okay, suppose now it's not clear how we will award revenues or returns for these companies who develop a vaccine against the COVID-19. Okay, but typically if two come up with the same solution, and it would be a standard kind of R&D process and patenting process, only the one who comes up with the solution first gets awarded a patent and therefore can sell this at a high price. The other one just doesn't have the patent. Okay, and the question is what we are asking. How does R&D competition look like in such a situation? How can we think of that? How can we model it? Then the other question is, of course, we are always interested in a viewpoint of society. Do firms invest too much or too little in R&D compared to the social optimal level? For the social planner, it's actually completely unimportant whether the new technology is developed on the morning or on the afternoon, or comes to the market on the morning of or the afternoon of this February day 1876. But for these two innovators, it's really decisive to be earlier, and that will give us a tendency for even an overinvestment in R&D, because it's so important to be first. The other point, of course, you will see R&D competition actually can speed up the expected date of innovation. So if you have competing projects, then you might end up with a success earlier. That's what we saw with the sequencing of the human genome project, DNA and so on. Here you had two consortia, and of course for both of them it was important to be first, and they tried hard to come up with the solution really early. And this is actually a topic, I don't know whether we will be able to cover that topic today, but what you will see is that under competition, firms might choose projects which are in a certain sense too risky from a viewpoint of a social planner. Okay, patent race. I give you here a very simple model, which is really not a race here, but where you I just mentioned it, where you just have some uncertainty in the R&D process. Until now, we only had certainty, no uncertainty, and now we are introducing uncertainty. Otherwise, a race doesn't make any sense, because you know you are slower than your rival, then it doesn't make sense to start running at all. Okay, so the idea here in this very simple model is the following. Suppose we have two firms, and each firm can set up an R&D laboratory. An R&D laboratory where you have some researchers in trying to get an innovation, and it costs you some investment I. Okay, and then by setting up this R&D laboratory, you get a certain probability alpha of discovering the new technology. Okay, and here we have actually three potential outcomes. It might be that if there are two firms investing, only one is successful, and in this case, it gets this value V. This is the value of the patent. If both firms are successful at the same time, you get V over gamma. Okay, and this gamma is something between 2 and infinity. Okay, it actually depends on the market structure you have after both innovated. If both innovated and they collude perfectly, you just get half of it, because you just share the pie. If you have Bertrand competition and you have two firms coming up with the same new technology, price will be cutthroat. You get price equal marginal cost, and therefore your profit will be zero. That's why gamma is infinity or infinite, and therefore V over something which is infinite is zero. Under Kuno, and if you assume linear demand is just 9 over 4, so you get 4/9 of the V. And if you don't discover anything, of course, you don't get anything. So here what you see is this race here does not really capture this importance of being first. We only can do that once. Once we do, we model it in a continuous time game and model. And however, that's rather complicated. I might briefly demonstrate that to you next week or in 2 weeks. But this is rather complicated. And so for the moment, just let us look into this case where we have uncertain R&D technology and uncertain R&D outcomes. Okay, clear so far? Hopefully I just erase it, because then it's easier for you to see all that. Okay, now we need some notation, and we denote the expected profit of firm K if n firms undertake R&D as this expectation pi K of n. Okay, and that's what we are doing right now. The expected profit of if a single firm undertakes R&D, so expected profit E, profit of firm 1 here, and only the firm one firm invests in R&D. And then what you see here is you invest in R&D. That's why you have to pay I, and you win with, or you find something, okay? You get some positive result with probability alpha, and with probability alpha, then you get the whole value V. We might also put that differently. With probability alpha, we are successful, so we get V minus I. With probability 1 minus alpha, we are not successful, so we don't get any V because we don't get the new innovation, but we have the cost nevertheless. So we could add here a 0, because if you are not successful, we just don't get anything. Okay, should be rather straightforward. Okay, very simple calculation of expected profit. Yeah, so, and of course the decision rule is very simple. You invest in R&D if your expected profit is non-negative or strictly positive. Okay, and that means you invest in R&D if alpha times V is greater than I. Now it's interesting what happens if we have more than one firm. We have exactly 2 firms in this case. And what is the expected profit then of firm K? Now, yeah, if only firm K is successful and if only firm 1 is successful and firm 2 not, it gets V. If both are successful, it gets V over gamma. And if the other is successful but you're not, it gets 0. Okay. And finally, it always has to pay the cost. And now in formal notation, so the expected profit of firm K, so now K might be either 1 or 2. If 2 firms are active, and now that's interesting. What is the probability that you are the sole inventor? Of course, you have to be successful. This is the alpha, but your rival must not be successful. And that's here the 1 minus alpha. Okay, so you are the only innovator if you get the innovation, that's with probability alpha, and your rival doesn't get the innovation, that's with probability 1 minus alpha. Both are assumed to be independent events, that's why we just can multiply it. Okay, and now it should also be clear the profit, if both are successful, accrues if both are successful. And what is the probability that both are successful? I must be successful. That happens with probability alpha. And my rival must be successful. That also happens with probability alpha. That's why we get this alpha times alpha here, and you get this profit. Of course, with probability 1 minus alpha times alpha, my rival would be successful, and with probability 1 minus alpha squared, no one would be successful. But that doesn't matter because my profit here is always 0. Okay, now that's what we have. And both firms invest in R&D, of course, if the profit here is non-negative or is positive. Okay, and that simply gives another rule on this I here, on this investment cost. Both invest if I just simplified that here, if this holds here. Okay, and that should be clear and straightforward. I next just present you some diagram where you see that in more detail. Of course, it's clear that if V increases, it's more likely that you invest in R&D. If I goes down, it's also more likely to invest in R&D. What is interesting, for instance, is what the effect of alpha, the probability of successes. And that's what we are looking into in the diagrams we have here. Here we have the equilibrium as a function of parameters alpha and I. So here I is something between 0 and 10. The value of the patent is 10. We assume Kuno here. And here we have alpha. And what we see here, this is just, I think I have written that somewhere, this is just the locus where a single firm which invests in R&D is indifferent between doing R&D and no R&D. So if we have a certain probability, okay, of success, if I is higher than this locus, you wouldn't invest in R&D. If I is lower, you would invest in R&D. So that's why you get here that one firm innovates in this range here. Okay, because here you have the locus where two firms just break even. Of course, below this locus, two firms innovate, and above one firm innovates. And so what you see clearly is for a given alpha, if you increase R&D investment cost, the number of firms investing in R&D decreases. What is even more interesting, of course, however, here is what happens with alpha. Suppose you have a given value of I, and now you increase the probability of a success, your alpha. What happens then? Now, you will see in a minute that you get a non-monotonous relation here, and that's what can be much better shown in the next slide here. In the next slide, because this covers Bertrand. Same thing as here. Okay. Same kind of lines here. Here the blue line is just the line where the combinations of I and alpha were given our V of 10 and our Bertrand competition, where a single firm is indifferent between investing in an R&D project and not. If I is higher for a given alpha, it won't invest in R&D. Here's the locus for two firms being indifferent between doing R&D and investing in a lab and not. And so again, we get here in the area in between, we get that one firm innovates, but not two. Okay? That should be clear. In terms of I, we get the same result if we move up for a given alpha horizontally. You will see if we increase I, the number, or if we decrease I, first of, if we start at 10 and we move down, we first don't get any R&D, then we get one firm doing R&D, and finally, for very low values of I, we get two firms doing R&D. But what you see here much more clearly, suppose I would be equal to 2, then suppose the probability of success is 0, then of course no one would invest in R&D. But then you see, if you increase the probability, I won't make a very good straight line. If you increase the probability of success, then at some point it becomes profitable for a single firm to invest in R&D. If we increase it further, you see that then two firms will invest in R&D. Okay, this is supposed to be a horizontal line. And however, if the probability to be successful is too high, we will only get a single firm investing in R&D. How should that make sense? Of course, it makes complete sense, because just look into, or perfect sense, just look into the case where alpha is 1, so that it's certain that you win. If you are a Bertrand competitor, and if you know your rival invests in R&D, then you will never invest in R&D, because you know for sure if you also invest, both of you will invest, price will be equal to marginal cost, and your operating profit is 0, and you have some R&D expenditure I. Okay, so and this also by continuity holds for say 90% chance. You don't also invest then. Only if you know that your rival invests, you only will invest if it's sufficiently or improbable, or it's sufficiently likely that your rival will not be successful. Okay? And that's really the interesting thing about alpha. It's not always a good thing if alpha, the probability of success increases, in particular with respect to the number of participants here. Okay, that's what we have here. Two firms innovate, that should have been clear. Yeah, the social optimum. Actually, we have a very strange definition here of a social optimum. It's more like a joint profit maximum. I have to tell you a story here, okay? It's more like a joint profit maximum. Suppose we look at Ford at the automaker. They have a research and development center, or they used to have one, I think, in Cologne, and of course they have one in Detroit. What are they inventing there, or what are they trying to develop? They're actually the same things. Okay, the question is, why should you, or under what circumstance should a firm run 2 R&D laboratories? And what you will see, of course, the bad thing about 2 R&D laboratories is that you have twice the cost. The good thing about the R&D laboratory is I will tell you something about the fuel cells later on, where Ford also tried to develop this technology. The good thing might be that you increase the probability of success. Okay, and that's what we are going to look into and to trade off right now. So the social optimum is better looked into as a situation of joint profit maximization, where you have a corporate headquarter which decides on the number of laboratories, okay, and you compare that with also a company which has 2 subsidiaries which are run as a profit center and which can on their own decide whether they want to run an R&D laboratory. And you see that there is some tension here. So here the point is this joint profit. If you have 2 firms investing in R&D, what are you getting? Naja, here is under what circumstance do you get the V? You get the V if, and here you have the gamma. So here we just look into the case in which exactly one firm invests in R&D. Excuse me, in which exactly one firm is successful in R&D. And we just saw that the probability that I'm successful and I'm the sole or the only inventor is alpha times 1 minus alpha, because my probability of success is alpha, my rival's probability of not being successful is 1 minus alpha. So here we have the probability that either Detroit is successful and Cologne is not, or Cologne is successful and Detroit is not. In each case, we have alpha times 1 minus alpha, and of course, we have 2 times that. Of course, then there is a probability or the possibility that both are successful, and this is just alpha times alpha. In this case, we get just V over gamma. The point is here, if we think here in terms of Ford, gamma probably is best thought of as being 2, because you would just collude in a sense, because you're a single company and you would just share this knowledge, this value of the patent. Okay, and of course, if you run 2 R&D laboratories, you have to pay for the 2 R&D laboratories. Okay. Hopefully, if there are any questions, just drop me a note in the slides. But the point is here, you will extensively discuss that in a tutorial class. Typically, we don't assume alpha is equal to 1/2, because that has the disadvantage that alpha is the same as 1 minus alpha. But you will have many cases where you can discuss that. Okay, so under what circumstance will now our Ford headquarter run 2 R&D laboratories? Naja, we know what the profit is if you run only 1 R&D laboratory. That's what we just derived. It's alpha times V minus I. And now the point is, you want to have 2 R&D laboratories operating if the profit from having the 2 R&D laboratories is greater than the profit from only having 1. Okay? And this just is if we substitute these two expressions here. Okay, that's what you get here. Okay, and that's if you simplify that, just believe it and check it. Okay, and you will calculate it anyway in the tutorial class. And now, is there a market failure? Is there overinvestment in R&D? Or if you leave the decision to your 2 profit center, to Cologne and to Detroit, whether they want to set up an own R&D laboratory. Naja, under what circumstance will they set up an R&D laboratory? Naja, if the profit is positive. and the profit would be positive. That's exactly what we just derived. You have, in a sense, this competitive situation. You have two firms being in the market, and this is then your profit. So you would have the situation that both set up an R&D laboratories if their specific R&D laboratories break even. That's what's written here. But the social or the headquarter perspective would only be that, and I have to erase that again here, you only set up two R&D laboratories if the profit from having two laboratories is higher than from having one. And so the question is, these decentralized decision-taking leads to overinvestment in R&D or a wrong investment decision, in that sense more like to a coordination failure rather than a market failure, if at the same time this thing here is positive, so each firm can break even or each R&D laboratory can break even, but from the headquarter perspective it would be better that only one firm or one subsidiary sets up an R&D laboratory. Okay, and now what I did then here is just substitute the values here. Here is this value here, which has to be greater than I. Just put this I on the other side, and here we get a similar. From here we get a similar. Oh, actually, it's this condition here. We put it here, and here we said greater or equal. We just turn that around, smaller or equal. And it's straightforward, and I just expanded that here to show that this is really possible. Okay, it's possible that two firms break even for a certain parameter values. It doesn't hold for all, and I will give you just a graphic representation where I just show you that. And here the point is, we will have a range in which two independent firms or subsidiaries will each invest in R&D, even though from a joint profit maximization perspective, it would be better if only one invested. And market failure or coordination failure occurs. That's what you see here. So what I showed here, again for Kuno, we might also do that for gamma equal to 2. But here I just use the Kuno in order to show you that it's not industry profit maximizing here. Again, we have our condition that at least one firm invests in R&D, and the second condition is that two firms break even, and the third condition is that it's better to have, in terms of joint profit maximization, it's better to have two R&D laboratories rather than one. So if we are down here, it would be optimal for Ford to run two R&D laboratories. However, and that's what you have, one firm innovates is up here, no excess R&D, but in this range, you have two firms investing in R&D, even though it would be optimal from the viewpoint of industry maximization if you have only one firm investing in R&D. Only if we are down here, only one firm, two firms should invest in R&D. And this is really interesting. If you think in terms of policy, you will see Cologne, if you're in this range here, Cologne could break even if they have a research laboratory, but from the viewpoint of the headquarter, it is better to not let Cologne have its own R&D laboratory, or not have Detroit its own R&D laboratory, even though we're probably more likely to set then or to close a Cologne R&D laboratory. But you see here, employees will have a tough time understanding why the R&D laboratory closes down, even though it's profitable in a sense. However, it's not profitable in the sense of joint profit maximization. Okay, that's what we have here. Of course, the same thing can be shown, and it's even more drastic if we have Bertrand, because here it would really mean that you have make yourself a profit or a competition if you're both successful, and you see we will only have the two firms innovating in this small range here. Okay, if we have a social planner doing that. And what you see here is that this alpha, the probability of success is very important, because if it's, say, 3/4, you rather want only to have one R&D laboratory, because you know it's quite likely that the other one is also successful and you would destroy your profit if you cannot coordinate on prices, that is. Okay? So the question is, from the industry perspective, they will always say, okay, if they do joint profit maximization, we rather don't want to both have two investors in R&D. We rather form a joint venture, but that's a different topic we will get back to later. Okay, is that clear? If it is, hopefully, and it will be straightforward, as you will see in the problems in the assignment. Okay. And now the next question is, remember in the very beginning we had this question. Oh, I just want to jump back here to my questions we started with, and here our question was, do firms, or what is the impact of R&D competition on the expected date of the innovation? Does R&D competition speed up innovation? So what we already answered here was, how does this R&D competition look like in such a situation of, say, in particular here, uncertainty? Okay, you get the conditions under which we get both firms active in the market doing R&D. I think in the assignment there is also a problem where we look into 3 potential firms. Then here you saw that here we might get overinvestment, at least from the viewpoint of joint profit maximization. From the viewpoint of consumer, it very often looks different. And here finally the question is, what is the impact of R&D competition on the expected date of innovation? Okay, now in order to do that, in order to look at the expected date of discovery, just suppose that the race of the model is repeated until one firm discovers the new product. Now, if you have a single firm, what does that mean? Now, in period one here, the probability that you have a success is alpha. So with probability alpha, you are finished in period 1. But with probability 1 minus alpha, you are not successful. So with probability 1 minus alpha, you end up in period 2. Okay? Of course, you only stay in period 2, so the race is finished in period 2 if you are then successful. That is, you have alpha. However, if you're not successful in period 2, that is with probability 1 minus alpha, then in period 2, you get to period 3. But then you already had 1 minus alpha squared, that's what you get here, times the 3, times the alpha. You only end in period 3 if you have the success, the alpha. And that's how it moves on. With probability 1 minus alpha raised to the power of 3, you end up in period 4, but only if there you have the alpha. And to put it in a general way here is, of course, you see the alpha is always important. It shows up in each term. And then you just get here the t, which is just our time index here. That's what we have here, times 1 minus alpha raised to the power of t minus 1. If it starts in t equal 1, here you see in t equal 1, t would be 1 minus 1 is 0. So we get 1 here. And here we get raised to the power of 1 in period 2, and so on. And again, this is an infinite series, and I think in the exam we even gave a hint how to what this gives you. Anyway, you see that this is the result here, and this is a very interesting result. What does it tell us? The expected date of discovery, if you have a single firm in investing in R&D, which has a probability of success, is 1 over alpha. So if the probability of success is 1/2, suppose alpha is 1/2, what does this mean? Epsilon of t is 1 over 1 over alpha is 2. So if the probability of success in each year is 1/2, you expect if alpha is 1/2 that it takes you 2 years. If it's 1/4, you expect that it's 4 years. Okay? That's how the probability of discovery right now translates into an expected date of discovery. Okay? And now, finally, what happens in the case of two firms? Now, this looks even nicer, okay? Because what is here? With a certain probability, you have a success, you end in period 1. And what is this probability? Now, this is just a probability of 1 minus that no one is successful in period 1. What is the probability that no one is successful in period 1? It's just 1 minus alpha times 1 minus alpha, so I say it's squared. No one has a success. This is actually what shows up here, because you end up in period 2 only if no one was successful in period 1, and that's just with probability 1 minus alpha squared. Okay, and actually 1 minus alpha squared, this would be 1 minus 2, actually plus 2 alpha minus alpha squared, which would be 2 alpha minus alpha squared, and this is exactly this expression here. Okay, and I have to erase it again. And you see here, you only end in period 2 if no one was successful in period 1. This is with probability 1 minus alpha squared. You only end in period 3 if no one was successful in period 2. And this is again with probability 1 minus alpha squared. So you end up here in period 3 if you have 1 minus alpha squared times 1 minus alpha squared times this here. And the general version, I have to erase many notes here again. The general version is just the same as previously. You have again this part in every term, because only then you end up in this period. You have again the t here, and you have this 1 minus alpha squared raised to the power of t minus 1. And now you get a slightly different result here, namely 1 over 2 minus alpha. And 1 over 2 minus alpha, 2 minus alpha is always smaller than 1. This is certainly greater. This increases the denominator and therefore decreases the whole value. It's smaller, and as a result, we get that opening more research labs shortens the expected date of discovery. So that gives you Ford's argument for having more R&D laboratories. Of course, it also has to take into account the cost of the R&D laboratory. It also shows you that competition in R&D speeds up R&D. So just to give you our example again, you saw with alpha 1/2, with one firm, the expected date of discovery was 2, and with two firms, 1 over 1/2 minus times, or that would then be, what is this? 3 over 2, and this would then be 4 over 3. So you only take, what is this, 12 plus 4 months, you only take 16 months if you have two firms. Okay? So it speeds up the date of discovery. This was actually our start into patent races. Actually, in this starting point was more like a discussion of how uncertainty affects R&D and what is the optimal strategy, in particular of, say, a company which might run more R&D laboratories, and how does R&D competition look like. And actually, that's it for today. Next week there is a holiday, so we won't meet for another lecture in economics on innovation next week. So you will have on Tuesday in a week, you will have only the tutorial class, and we will meet again only in 2 weeks. It's no problem, because we have sufficient ground covered here, and I think I really need this break, because it's rather exhausting to do all these YouTube live streams, and hopefully we can discuss a little bit more on this topic here. I will be available on WebEx, and I thank you again for your participation, and look forward to meet you again in 2 weeks. Thanks and goodbye.